Bir 10-15 saniye beklerseniz, biraz geç geliyor çünkü.
Biraz da
I can write to you
herkes
first.
gelmesini bekleyeceğiz galiba,
Tamam.
değil mi? Bana da requestler geliyor ama I see some familiar faces. Hello everyone. We have 27 participants right now. We will wait a little bit. Maybe 1 or 2 minutes will be good for other participants to come. So we just started. I see some familiar faces. Thank you all for coming. It is very nice to see you. So this is the 4:08 now. Shall we wait till 10? 4:10, and then we can start.
I think this is very generous.
Let's start now. Okay, just
I think we can start.
4:09 will be good.
Okay.
Negotiating already. Okay.
How is the weather in London, Deniz? Are you also freezing there?
Today it's good, but the last weeks have been really miserable. Yeah. It was very dark and rainy. So I think this is the first proper day of spring.
Yeah, I remember once saying in August to my husband that once the summer comes, we should do this and that. And I realized it's August. There is no summer in England. I think English summer is in April or something.
Yes, that's probably true.
And you won't be able to come to Turkey this summer, huh, Deniz?
Well, it looks like it with the red list and everything.
Okay, hopefully we will see you in person soon. Still, just to start a little bit, maybe this is maybe the only advantage of pandemic environment that we can meet virtually, and we get very used to it, especially in academics. There are lots of, it is becoming hectic world of webinars, online virtual meetings. So thank you again and again very much, both to Deniz and Yvonne and all the organization committee, all the partners in our faculty and the university, and all of you, the participants. It is very nice to see you here in this hectic world of webinars. I will start. Yes, it is 4:10 now, so let's start. This is our very first seminar. We are very newly founded commission in Faculty of Letters of 9 Eylül University. Our name is International Studies Commission. Let me just tell you all the names because this is the very first, this is the opening session. So I'm the head of the commission. My name is Gül Özeteşler Ülkücan. I am from sociology department. You can see Elif Keser Kayaalp. She is also co-head to this commission from museums, Department for Museums, and Duygu Yurttaşen. Again, from our department, sociology, Özlem Öztopçu, Serkan Keçeci, Selva Ülbe, and Asile Ertekin is also in the organization committee. I am thankful to all of you. This is, it's been just 2 months, I said, I guess. So this is the first seminar. We call it, this is the first series of seminar, and we called it International Culture Studies. Culture studies is very important, very valuable area of study for me because of its comprehending power relations, criticizing power relations, trying to understand more on meaning, changing context, relations in societies, and trying to bridge macro-social mechanisms to individual agency positions. It is very valuable because of these contributions. And I believe representations of childhood is also very quite expanding area of study. And it is all very exciting to welcome this. Deniz is a dear friend of mine, and Yvonne is contributing us through the network of Elif. So we also know
she's a dear friend of mine.
Also dear friend, but it is not only friendship, but very valuable scholars in represent in childhood studies, we can say. Let me see if I forgot anything. So this for this very first meeting, we will be these fine scholars, Deniz Arzuk and Yvonne Petrina, and we will be talking on representations of childhood. Deniz will give us some perspectives from Britain and Turkey. So I will introduce Deniz little bit more as she will be the first speaker, and I will be her moderator, and Yvonne, Elif will be moderating Yvonne's speech. So Deniz has already sent us a recording, and we will start it in a few minutes. And she's introducing herself very well in the recording, but I will try to just introduce our linkage. I know Deniz for a very long time. She's also from Izmir, and I know her from Izmir. Firstly, we met in Izmir, but we studied together in Boğaziçi University, Atatürk Institute for Modern History, and we were very lucky to study with the same supervisor, who is Ayşe Buğra, who is very fine, very precious, inspiring scholar in Turkish academia, and very productive one as well, and very helpful supervisor. And we had the chance to work with her as well. So I will just give the space to Deniz then. I think this is this can be enough for an introduction, and they will give an introduction for themselves kindly. Thank you very much.
I'm thinking we will just continue with the presentation. Maybe I will speak on it a little bit afterwards. So
it's up to you. You can, if you want to say a few words, you can. But it is also very compact, very organized representation. But
so yes, let's get on with the presentation first.
Yes, let's do that.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, and especially for introducing Ayşe Buğra as well. So thanks. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Deniz Arzuk, and today I will be talking about my ongoing research on the news coverage about children in popular newspapers in the 1980s and 1990s. To introduce myself briefly, I'm a Marie Curie Fellow based at University College London Social Research Institute. Before moving to UCL, I was awarded my PhD degree from the Atatürk Institute for Modern Turkish History at Boğaziçi University, and then worked as a Swedish Institute and Raoul Wallenberg Institute researcher at the Child Studies Unit at Linköping University in Sweden. My research primarily deals with the relations between social change and the conceptualizations of childhood in the contemporary world, with a particular focus on inequality, discrimination, and distinction. I come from a history background, but I consider myself to be a childhood scholar. So before I begin, let me say a few words about the social studies of childhood. Ours is a very young discipline, which was only established in the last 30 plus years, and it primarily relates to the study of childhood in society. And that is to say that we critically analyze the position of children in society and the relations between adults and children, as well as between children. And in the last 3 decades, child studies contributed to our knowledge about children and childhood, making our understanding increasingly complex as we moved from thinking of the child in relation to the adult as a yet to develop, yet to socialize lesser person, to thinking of children as the center of interwoven social relations. We study how children's lives are determined by macrostructures and analyze how childhood is controlled by institutions like schools, hospitals, prisons, workplaces, and organized religions. We inspect children and childhood in relation to social status, social justice, and power, and in relation to variables like gender, class, and ethnicity. We examine children in families and in care relationships. We examine their interrelations with other generations. We theorize children's rights, and not only their rights to provision and protection, but also to participation. We question the normative expectations about children's bodies in relation to various isms like sexism, ableism, and racism. We think of new methods to give voice to children. We explore how children relate to nature and animals. We analyze how they produce and reproduce culture. We study how they relate to media and new media. We investigate their materialities. We examine their relationships with money and consumption. We analyze children's geographies and movements, rural and urban childhoods. And we study childhoods through time, both in their local specificity and in their global genericity and in their connectedness to other children. In other words, we are continuously looking for ways to expand our knowledge about the complexities of childhood, and largely inspired by feminist efforts to introduce gender as an analytical category, social studies of childhood aims to understand how one becomes a child. And for this, we examine childhood as a variable in social analysis. And an important part of this analysis is to study changing ideas about who is a child and what is childhood across time and place. So one of the central premises of social studies of childhood is that childhood changes through time and across contexts. But in common parlance, we find that the change of childhood is often referred to as the disappearance, the loss, or even the death of childhood. The concern over changing childhood is quite understandable from a philosophical standpoint, because the child who inhabits childhood has not been in the past, but will be in the future. Thus, the child embodies a break from the past and a dive into an uncertain future in a way that the adult does not. And that is one reason why children and childhood are paid particular attention in times of dramatic change. And one such period of dramatic change in recent history was the end of the 20th century. To give a very brief historical background, globally, the 1980s and 1990s were a period characterized with the erosion of traditional safety nets, increased inequality, and social insecurity. The social, economic, political, cultural, and structural transformations of this period were so profound that we needed new concepts for analysis, such as neoliberalism, new capitalism, advanced marginality, and liquid modernity. But global transformation echoed differently in different localities. For instance, in Britain, these were decades of deindustrialization, soaring unemployment, welfare retrenchment, and at the same time, family and household structures were significantly transformed, and cultural tensions surfaced with the rise of civil and social movements. In Turkey, the period was marked by the 1980 coup d'etat that cleared the way for uncontested economic restructuring, which included increasing privatization of health and education, the deterioration of income distribution, and the emergence of new living standards for people from different social strata. So these were also the years when voluntary and forced migration transferred Turkey's great urban-rural gap into cramped city centers. It was no surprise then that in the 1980s and the 1990s, the loss of childhood as we know it had been a recurring theme in popular Turkish and British national newspapers. And in this presentation, I will raise several questions about how these texts framed the disappearance of childhood. So what was meant by the loss of childhood, and which childhood or whose childhood was perceived to be lost and for which reasons? And what do these tell us about how childhood is defined and who is considered to be a child? This paper is an output of my ongoing research, which is a European Commission-funded research project that investigates changing ideas about childhood in Turkey and in Britain. And the project builds on my doctoral research on media representations of childhood. My focus is on the connections between constructions of childhood in these two local contexts, which emerged in response to the shared global processes of the period. And I aim to analyze how ideas about childhood travel and are appropriated and recontextualized with impacts on the status of children and childhood. My analysis builds on data collected by various methods, including systematic sampling and keyword searches. In addition to perusing the paper archives of Hürriyet, Tercüman, Türkiye, and Milliyet newspapers from Turkey, which represent different political perspectives, I have also researched British newspapers, including the tabloids Daily Mail and Daily Mirror, and the broadsheet newspapers, the Daily Telegraph, the Times, the Guardian, and the Independent, which again have different political affiliations. The British newspapers are all available in digital format, which allows me to conduct an initial keyword search with the phrase disappearance of childhood, which was followed by subsequent searches with keywords and phrases that came up frequently. The phrase that I have picked for my initial search is the title of Neil Postman's 1982 dated book. In the book, Postman argues that childhood was a product of printing press, which put knowledge behind the wall of literacy, which in turn brought the separation of children and adults. He argued that by giving children premature access to adult knowledge, television culture contributed to the erasure of the boundaries between childhood, which he believed would eventually result in the end of childhood. I have picked this as a case study because during my PhD research, I had found that in Turkey in the 1990s, many newspapers began to circulate comments about the erasure of conventional childhood experiences. And all newspapers that were part of my research published articles about lost childhoods. Postman's book wasn't translated into Turkish, but it was apparently picked up by journalists who monitored foreign press, and there were quite a few direct references to the book. And although Postman's analysis is strongly embedded in the Northern American context, the frequency of verbatim uses of the book's title in both British and Turkish newspapers signals that it was one of the central texts that ignited the debate about disappearing childhood. However, I should underline that Postman's book only provided a catchphrase for the debate, and I found that newspapers offered different interpretations of what aspect of childhood was disappearing and why. For example, there were news reports about how children spent their daily lives, what they played with, what they ate, drank, and wore, how they related to adults, and how adults related to them. And most importantly, almost all of these reports were presented with the journalistic style and tactics of the 1980s and 1990s, with sensational headlines, deliberately controversial comments, and exaggerated impressions. So I found that these years were marked by episodes of intense worry about childhood. And in my analysis of these pieces, I largely drove on moral panic theory. The term moral panic is usually attributed to Stanley Cohen, who wrote Folk Devils and Moral Panic about UK popular media and social reaction. And there are, of course, various definitions of the concept, but in general, a moral panic is defined as something or someone being presented as a threat to social order by the media, which creates a consensus among the public against that threat and ignites a series of predictable but disproportional responses ranging from concern to hostility, but usually without actually addressing the real reason, which is an anxiety about social order. And more politicized theories also argue that moral panics are often used to divert attention and persuade the public of the efficiency of certain harsh measures to control the threat. And the reports I have analyzed are consistent with this definition. They do specify a threat to children's well-being, they ignite an amplified and emotional response, and they are closely related to worries about changing society. But in my analysis, I also take into consideration David Buckingham and Helle Strangat-Jensen's well-thought-out critique of some fundamental problems of classic moral panic theory, and particularly their suggestion to avoid a straightforward and simplistic interpretation of these panics, because the reality is usually much more complex. So after this rather lengthy introduction, let me move on to my findings. And in the second half of my talk, I will focus on some of the central themes and trends I have identified, as well as similarities and differences between Turkey and Britain. I have found that worries about children usually concentrated on 5 related but distinct themes, and these are children's culture, consumption, generational hierarchies, parenting, and children's time. To start with children's culture, I have found many examples from British newspapers which argued that the greatest threat to childhood was premature contact with adult culture. And in this, they agreed with Neil Postman about television's attack on children's innocence. According to this view, television exposed children to adult content like violence and sexuality long before they were ready. And by introducing children to information about the adult world, it demolished the hierarchy between adults and children. So it was presumed that once children were allowed access to that knowledge, they would lose both their innocence and their respect for grown-ups. And this concern over children witnessing inappropriate content on television arrived in Turkey quite later, well into the 1990s, when private television channels were first introduced. But I have also found a variation of this theme, both in Turkey and in Britain. In this interpretation, the greatest problem with television was seen not as children learning about life earlier than they should, but quite the opposite. It was argued that television shortened children's attention span and pacified them and kept them away from more favorable activities like interacting with peers and reading and learning, or in other words, growing and developing. So these critics were more worried about television and adult culture dumbing children down, thus robbing them of their childhood. So television and popular culture in general killed childhood, either by making them grow up too quickly or too late. Moving on to concerns about the child consumer, according to British journalists, children's increasing consumption power combined with liberal child-rearing practices resulted in a drastic change in consumption patterns. And many reports agreed that children as consumers were behaving just like adult consumers who sought instant gratification. The idea that being embedded in the market was not only harmful for children, but also for the greater idea of childhood was a sentiment shared by various different political positions. And moreover, there was a gender dimension of this worry too. There was a strong emphasis on girls aiming to look like adult women, and less so about little boys looking like adult men. And as was in Britain, there was a strong focus on the child consumer who gained access to a grown-up consumer culture in Turkey as well. There were deep worries about advertisements targeting children, as well as children who are becoming more demanding. And this discourse was also highly gendered and particularly focused on the girl child and sexuality, for instance, on little girls dressed in feminine outfits. In Britain, some of the examples that discussed children's consumption also focused on what they consumed and observed that children and adults began to consume similar products. The assumption was that given the power to choose what to get, children would instinctively go for unhealthy, bland, and easy alternatives. But growing up was meant to be a transition from childish impulsiveness to control, and from comfortable junk consumption to acquired tastes. So they needed adult guidance to grow into these higher tastes. So it was particularly worrying that adults were also consuming junk too, by adopting childlike food or fast fashion or childish leisure activities like leisure games, like video games. Of the child and adult worlds. And I found that in many examples from Britain, the question, is childhood disappearing, was almost synonymous with are grown-ups refusing to grow up? And according to many commentators, the answer was obvious. Children were growing up too fast because adults were refusing to mature. So there was an emphasis on parents, and particularly the new generation of working mothers who were baby boomers and represented a break from the common decency of the post-war era and post-war adulthood as a somber, dignified life stage. So what was lost, they argued, were intact two-parent families with established gender roles where fathers were breadwinners and mothers were homemakers. And many different journalists, including well-known conservatives and those who purposefully distanced themselves from those, agreed that these new adults were unfit to raise a responsible youth population who would carry the country into the future. In comparison, one of the most significant differences in Turkey was that there was no similar emphasis on adults behaving like children or the hierarchies of the generational order. There were a number of news about changing family structures, divorced parents, etc., but these were very few and far between. And this was because in the 1980s and 1990s, the family structure was still shifting from traditional extended families to two-parent households, but not to single-parent families. And female participation in the workforce remained low, indeed even got lower compared to the 1970s. However, in both contexts, I have found a strong focus on parenting, both as the cause of and the solution to all social ills. In Turkey, contrary to the late 1970s, when only one of the newspapers occasionally published expert advice, by the late 1990s, all newspapers had regular columns reserved for parenting advice. And in many of these examples, parents were viewed as the primary reason why childhood was under threat. By doing too little or too much, by failing to protect their children or by overprotecting them, by indulging their desires or by applying too much discipline. So simultaneous to the presentation of good parenting as the panacea to anything that might go wrong, bad parenting was constructed as the cause of everything that did. And although the focus on parenting was visible in both contexts, there were differences between what was seen as good parenting. For example, according to British newspapers, new parents went a step too far to protect their children and become too controlling, which was threatening childhood as we knew it. So an analysis of these pieces reveals that they saw children's independent movement as one of the quintessential features of childhood as we knew it. And in this context, childhood as we knew it was a time of free movement, of idleness, and time spent away from adult supervision and regulation. Slightly different from Britain, in Turkey there was a lack of emphasis on children's independent movement, free roaming, and communal play. On the contrary, new parents were advised to be more hands-on, more involved with their children, and, for example, spend more quality time together if they were to have a good childhood. But parenting advice in both contexts used the same top-down approach and commanding language to address parents and carers of children and warn them about what they should be doing. It was parents who were both the subjects and the audience of these texts. And moreover, they were also expected to regulate their own responses to the moral panics initiated by news and control their worries, to calculate and navigate risk, to find a balance for their children to have a good childhood. In other words, these moral panics responsibilized parents not only with protecting their children, but also with protecting their childhood. And this responsibilization diverted the attention away from problems that cannot be addressed by the parents, but required social solutions. Finally, I have found that many pieces on the end of childhood focused on the changing organization of children's time. In Britain, this worry was often expressed as a nostalgia about what children used to do in the past. It was observed that communal outdoor play was increasingly replaced with solitary indoor play with commercial toys. And these different types of play from the past and the present were compared and contrasted as good play versus bad play. And the widely accepted view was that the changing nature of play would be detrimental for children's social development in the long term. Quite related to this, there were also worries about how children's time was regulated and structured, and how children were ferried from violin lessons to pony rides and other structured leisure activities. And these concerns about children's time were also closely related to worries about increased expectations from children. Some reporters argued that the pressure to perform was visible even in early years settings, which would eventually result not only in the loss of childhood, but even in the loss of the concept of infancy. So in short, there were worries about the increasing responsibilities of children. In contrast, in Turkey, where structured leisure activities like private courses were only available to a few children in the 1990s, these activities were interpreted as something positive. But as in Britain, there was a visible focus on increasing pressures on children, which was discussed more in relation to school exams and schoolwork rather than in relation to structured leisure activities. And this was linked to the competitive structuring of the education system. In Turkey, several journalists commented that children were crushed under heightened expectations in this competitive system, and they were prematurely burdened with adult responsibilities. And a scrutiny of these articles reveals that what was feared to be disappearing was a carefree, innocent childhood, devoid of hard work in both contexts. To conclude, I would like to go back to my starting point. So how did these texts frame what they presented as the disappearance of childhood? I found that a similar worry about a changing childhood lingered, despite many differences. So we see the same rhetoric of disappearing childhood surfacing in relation to television, to video games, violence, sex, parents, exams, stress, play, etc. And the question is there a meaningful narrative to be found in these different takes on what exactly was lost? Looking back at the moral panics of the 1990s, I will argue that they stemmed from real worries about real children and expressed a genuine frustration and helplessness, albeit in a very emotional way. I have observed that most of these pieces framed the transformation of childhood as a symptom of unwelcome social change, but since change was specific to localities, so were the worries about that change. Many of the examples I have studied implied very specific concerns about children, such as the economization of childhood and the integration of children in market logic. And for example, there was very apparent unease with children being responsibilized with constantly investing in themselves, which in terms of political economy can be seen as children being positioned as neoliberal citizens in the making. But these worries remained largely decontextualized, and the causes for these were usually identified to be cultural, technological, or even spatial rather than social or political. And as a result, these very valid concerns often appeared to be a vague worry at the face of change and came across as an ambiguous and slightly unreasonable fear of the new and a mourning for the old. And although it is very mind-opening to dwell on what these worries were about and how their focus changed, as I conducted this research, what I found equally interesting is what these worries were not about. For example, in both contexts, most of these worries were about obviously middle-class childhoods, and I found a general lack of interest in social justice. I have found many examples which discuss the child who had leisure time, whose leisure was structured by responsible adults, and who had consumption power, but not that many examples that turn to, for instance, inequalities in childhood, the transformation of children's geographies, the lack of public provision for children, or inclusivity and accessibility. And most importantly, I observed a general lack of interest in children whose childhoods did not fit this ideal. For instance, in Turkey, there were many articles about children who lost their childhoods because they worked too hard for school, but none, for instance, about the lost childhoods of children who did paid or unpaid work or had no access to schooling. In Britain, there were many pieces which pronounced childhood dead when child consumers bought fast foods and fizzy drinks, but not when free school meals were cut. And in some significant examples, the children who were forced to grow up early were literally compared to children who never had a treasured childhood to begin with. For instance, one reporter from Turkey observed that pupils carrying heavy backpacks to school resembled child laborers going to work. Another commented that girl children in adult clothes looked like lolitas, which was a label that reporters also used for children involved in prostitution. And in a piece about child poverty in Mozambique, one reporter from Britain wrote they would have a good childhood to remember because there was no television to corrupt that. In other words, this theme in itself assumed a proper and idealized notion of childhood and mourned for its loss. Thus, the characteristics newspapers devoted to a particular version of childhood crystallized in this anxious narrative about the loss of childhood, and these pieces specified which aspects of which particular childhoods were to be rescued from disappearing. And in doing so, these pieces defined the meaning of ordinary, proper, and precious childhood, which was essentially an exclusionary practice that involved the unchilding or the eviction of children from the realm of childhood for children whose childhoods did not fit into this ideal. So to sum up, representations of childhood not only reflect constructions of childhood, but they also construct what childhood is. And these pieces that I have analyzed were part of a contest to specify which aspects of childhood were to be valued and held on to. And I believe my scrutiny reveals the need for a more nuanced understanding of representations of changing childhoods in the 1980s and 1990s. I also believe that this is something we need to do to contextualize and historicize these important decades as a time not only of straightforward compliance, but also of resistance, conflict, and worry. But instead of wrapping my discussion with this rather bleak conclusion, I would like to conclude with a quote from Lambie and Funnell, who write, quote, "Theorists of moral panics should not simply stand by when moral panics erupt, but should be prepared to use their knowledge to make a difference," unquote. So what can we do? I believe a very good start to make a difference as we remake the future would be to resituate the child in the discussion beyond the binary of ordinary children in a family, at school, with leisure time and consumption power and responsible adults to organize their movements, who are the subjects of these panics, and all other possible variations of childhoods who are ignored. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deniz, for this very organized presentation with all the aspects coming from theoretical background you introduced with childhood studies, and then switch to your own findings. It was very helpful and exciting to listen all of it. And shall we start for the questions first? Maybe, or would you like to add something or say something afterwards?
I think I have said enough.
Yeah.
Too much.
Yes, it was very organized, very compact presentation. I
have a question.
I am not, since this is the first time we are using this Zoom application for our meetings, I think you can raise hands and I can make you unmute, I guess. Can you unmute yourselves?
Yes, I think they can.
Not you. You are the. I think you are co-host. Yes, you are co-host. Ayşe, for instance, can you unmute yourself? No. Okay.
Then maybe it's better that they write their questions. Sure, they can.
I can. Yeah. If you raise your hands to ask questions, I can unmute you, or you can write your questions in the chat section, or I can ask my own questions.
Shall I ask a question about the presentation?
Yes, please, Ayşe.
First of all, thank you so much for such a great presentation and the organization of my ex-faculty.
She is Ayşe, by the way. Ayşe is our former student. I was also her supervisor in her MA thesis. She is very interested scholar in childhood studies as well. Yes.
In my doctoral studies, and I would like to also focus on children's television. I try to be focused on the agency of childhood in children's television and the link together with the notion of nostalgia. Because when we talk about the television and childhood, the general literature focuses on the more children expose television and media, the more they show aggressive behavior, etc. But as far as I research, the social agency of childhood focus on the idea that childhood is not a social biological symptom, or it's a socially constructed, as Dr. Arzuk focused on. So how can we conceptualize the active agency of childhood in children's television when we talk about these children's and for instance, in TRT archival record and videos, in social media, in daily dialogues, and they focus on the in the back 1970s and 80s, how the children use Turkish efficiently, and they compare the contemporary childhood practices. In this regard, no more less, there is a pacifization of childhood. Of course, they are share their from all these societal changes, but there's a kind of pacifization of childhood in terms of social agency. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. And I think it's a really interesting point. And there are some very exciting research projects going on. For example, in LSE, there is Sonja Livingston, who works on digital technologies and their relation to childhood and how children perceive these differently from how it is constructed by adults. And it is very interesting to see that this ongoing concern and worry about how children relate to culture and how that constantly goes to somewhere bad. So I think it's visible even in the 19th century when adults talked about childhood, and then they were expressing worries about how childhood is going to the worst. So how a certain version of childhood is lost and how things are going bad. And this is something that we see quite often when we look at children's relation to culture, especially to new appearing versions of media like television and internet, and how children relate to those. But I think that's something that needs to be considered. And we should also perhaps try to see how children make sense of this, because children don't have that sort of reference point that we do have. They don't know about the 1980s version of television, and they don't have that reference point to see what was different, and they don't really have the choice. They don't really have a choice to make between that kind of television and this kind of television. This is what they have, and this is what they relate with. But they also construct it in the playground with their peers. So this is a very interesting subject. I think I wish you the best of luck with your PhD research.
Are you raising hand, Elif? Or if it's...
Actually, I did, but I think there are other questions, so I can leave my to the end, maybe after also Yvonne presented, because it's related to both speakers, I think.
There's one question in the chat. Shall I read it then? Ömer, can you see the chat, Deniz? Ömer Kulhancı is asking a question.
If you like, I can read the question first and then try to give an answer, or
you choose. I can also read if you prefer.
Okay.
I have a question on Bourdieu's social capital, if it could be utilized to understand childhood. As far as I understood, we cannot think childhood's death, as it has already been an experience of miniature adulthood. This might be stemmed from financial interests. The question is, if you could tell us about social capital regarding childhood and children's experiences. For example, how children perceive their social capital and its potential. That's it.
Thank you for the question. I think Bourdieu's concepts are very relevant when trying to understand childhood, especially from a social point. If I understand correctly, I'm not sure I follow what you mean when you say we cannot say that childhood is dead, as it's already been an experience of miniature adulthood. I think this is quite the opposite of what childhood studies has to say. So perhaps maybe you can just explain that bit a little bit. Sorry about this, but I think that positionality is very important in terms of children and how they relate to society. And that is not only between children and adults, but also between children as well. So social capital is something that is built on from very early on. And most of the practices that the newspapers, the news pieces that I told you about, were very particularly interested in how social capital is built for children, and they looked at children's practices as a way of socializing them, but also as a way of building capital, as a way of sustaining the existing hierarchies, the power relations in the society, and as a way of perhaps maintaining the status quo via childhood, via keeping children separate, via structuring different childhoods. So I think Bourdieu's work is very relevant when looking at these. I especially draw a lot on his work on, I'm trying to remember the name of the book in English, La Misère du Monde. Does anyone? The Weight of the World, sorry. The Weight of the World, I especially draw on his Weight of the World and how he defines positionality and how inferior positions in the society might feel differently than others and how that relates to childhood. And I hope that answers it.
Is there any other question, maybe? Then, since we are waiting, maybe there can be also some contribution if you feel like. But I would like to hear more about the differences. You were comparing British media representation of parenting, especially regarding to the part of parenting styles. I would like to hear more from you. How, especially if we see anything within your research, if we see anything in these discussions relating to diminishing power of social state or diminishing appearance of social state and conceptualizing social state policies, social policies, and just putting all the burden on parents in raising children? Or do we see any discussions within this period, 1980s and 90s? And I have another point. Maybe we can discuss it later after Yvonne's presentation. During this pandemic environment, this is not related to your topic though, because it is restricted to 80s and 90s, but maybe you can comment more on pandemic time and childhood, your observation in the media or in general in academia, or your own experiences, however you like. But we can keep it to the late discussion after Yvonne's presentation if you feel like. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. About parenting and about the role of the state in childcare and providing childcare services and other types of support for carers of children, I have found lots of examples that express frustration with the way parents are responsibilized, but I haven't found that many examples about the state's role in this. So I see this concern coming from parents, especially this complaint that everything falls onto them, and parents are clearly not happy with this, but then it somehow evolve into a criticism of how social policy is organized in both contexts, both in Britain and in Turkey. And there are so many differences between how parenthood is constructed in both contexts. For example, in Turkey, it is advised that parents spend more time with their children and be more involved with their children and do things together and invest in them. And in Britain, we see quite the opposite. And it is advised that parents leave their children be and spend more time with their friends and socialize. But I think the similarities are more striking, even though the advice is quite the opposite in both contexts. Both of them only address the parents and both of them only take the parent as the responsible party in keeping childhood good or bad. So it is always the parent, and all of these pieces talk to the parents and they responsibilize parents. So there isn't enough talk about, I think, the social aspects and political aspects of it. But you can see it in between the lines. You can read it in between the lines that people are not actually happy with how they have to carry everything, how they have to provide the food, the care, and okay their children outside school and do everything, but it doesn't evolve into a demand of something else.
Thank you very much. I hope we will discuss a little bit more, especially focusing on pandemic times and childhood and raising children. Shall we? Is there another question, or you can keep your questions and ideas maybe later on, waiting for Yvonne's presentation? Shall we start with Yvonne?
Yes, Yvonne is ready. Yeah, yes, it's a great pleasure to welcome Yvonne and of course Deniz today. It was very interesting to hear your project and it's really exciting. I'm keeping my questions for later. Yvonne Petrina is the director of Kinder Academy in Fulda. She's a dear friend and colleague. She did her PhD in Oxford University on Byzantine archaeology. We also had the same supervisor. I didn't know that you and Deniz had the same supervisor, so this is also a big coincidence. She's an expert on Byzantine jewelry. She's a fantastic scholar and excellent presenter, and she's also affiliated with Ludwig Maximilian University, where she used to teach before joining to Kinder Academy in Fulda. Well, I look forward to your talk. The floor is yours, Yvonne. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for opening the stage. I'm very happy to spend my afternoon with you all. So thanks for the invitation. It's been a long time that I was talking in English, so all apologies if I'm start searching for words and sentences, whatever. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. I hope that's okay with you. Let's try to find the PowerPoint presentation. Well, my talk is less theoretical. It's more practical. Just a second. I'm going to present you with a part of my work. As Elif has stated, I'm the director of Kinderakademie Fulda. Sorry, this is not the first foil. There it is. First of all, well, you see a picture of the building, of the exterior of Kinderakademie Fulda there. It's first, you're probably not very familiar with Germany or the geography of Germany. I did not know where Fulda was before I started working here. So it's a medium-sized town in Germany, in the center of Germany. Should pop in. It's exactly in the middle of Germany where the red arrow shows. So it's a small town. It has around 100,000 inhabitants. Well, and the Kinderakademie Fulda was founded in 1991, 30 years ago now, by an adorable couple. You see them in the picture. It's Helen Bonsel to the left and Tassilo Bonsel to the right. He is a cardiologist. He was working at the local hospital as a professor, and she had a lot of free time. And when they visited the United States, they came across a children's museum in Boston, and they brought the idea over to Germany because there was no such institution here in Germany in the 1980s. So Kinderakademie Fulda is Germany's first children's museum. And Helen Bonsel started with a double-decker, a London double-decker bus, in fact. So she picked up children from different areas in town. She started painting with them. She made exhibitions in this double-decker bus. And yeah, after a while, they thought, this is not enough space for us. We have to be more creative. We need an open space. And they bought this building, the building I showed to you before. It's an industrial building. So this building was not built to house a museum at all. It was a part of a textile industry. Fulda had a big textile industry since the 1850s. So this is the building. It has around 2,000 square meters. So it's quite a small museum, but actually quite large enough for this town. So to the beginning of Kinderakademie Fulda, 1991, children were involved. They came up with their own wishes. What should this building have? What should be inside the building? What activities should we be able to do? And they were also able to take part in the design. So you see the model of the building right here in the center of the photo. And they said, oh, this room could contain an exhibition about this and that, the other room about this. And they even went so far that parts of the interior were designed by children, like the bathroom tiles, for example. And the very interesting thing is that yeah, we don't really have any vandalization. I think it's a kind of special spirit. People who come here feel that this building, meant a lot or still means a lot to children, that a lot was invested, a lot of ideas, so that there is a special spirit. And this is probably also the reason why no one ever destroyed anything inside this building. I'm very proud of this up to the present day, so I hope it stays like this. But I think it has to do with the special spirit. This is another example in how children were involved in designing the area around the building. There was a competition about a statue that should be erected in front of the building in the courtyard. So children made their own models and submitted these models, and a jury of children decided which statue should stand in front of Kinderakademie. And here you see the final sculpture, which is, may I return to this slide. It's on the left-hand side. You see the pink sign with Kinderakademie and this little man standing there. So these are old photos as well. You see family Bonsel, children who were involved, the mayor and other people who were taking part in the development of this building, this institution. And well, as I said before, Kinderakademie Fulda is a museum on one hand, but it's also another kind of institution. As the name states, it's an academy. So there are actually two parts. The museum has developed since 1991. We have a large hands-on area with objects which kids can use for playing, for skillfully learning, for just being curious. And we have another part, which is the academy. And I'm going to show you a few examples about how Kinderakademie Fulda works. But first of all, I'm starting to talk a little about the purposes. So what family Bonsel had in mind, they wanted to establish a social gathering place for different kinds of young people. So single children, single young adults, friends who can come here in the afternoon and can start being creative, inventing things. Families can come here, but also adults. And it's very fascinating. We have a lot of adult groups coming to the museum, and they're really very happy to be presented with information, scientific information in children's words, actually. So that's very fascinating to see. So it's not only children who come here and are really excited, but also grown-ups. And we try to be inclusive as possible. That's not always very easy because, mostly families come to our place who already have an interest in arts, cultures, natural sciences. But it's very difficult to reach the others, to go outward and to reach people who have other, let's say, cultural backgrounds, or whose families are not that interested in all these kinds of things. We try to do this, but it's very tough, to be honest. The other purpose is out of school learning. So we have different, or a lot of school groups, classes who are coming here and take part in a great variety of programs. We have a lot of disciplines we are using here. So you probably know the MINT word. It's mathematics, informatics, natural sciences, and techniques. So we cover all these. We cover the arts, we cover culture. So we try to cover everything. And thus we are trying to close the gaps in the German school system. So maybe you are familiar with the German school system. It has always been quite good, but in recent years, they start shortening. They start shortening, especially arts, music, and a lot of things which are on our list. So we are really trying to close these gaps. And we are trying to assist the children to further them, to develop, to become more self-confident, to work in teams, which is very important for us, to strengthen their confidence. So these are the purposes we have. Family Bonsall already had in mind in 1991, and we still continue this tradition. So another text slide, I'm sorry for this, but we are going to see more photos and pics of the museum and the academy soon. We use a great variety of methods. They are all listed here. When children or young adults come to us, they can play, they can learn, they can be creative. So there are a lot of possibilities they can use. Sorry, this was the wrong slide. It's all, just directly made for children. Participation is a big word, and it's one of the most important things for us. So whatever children see, they should be able to touch, they should be able to smell, they should be able to feel. The next point is stimuli for different senses. This is very important, so that you're just not being taught like in school, but that you really use your senses and that you're trying as much as possible. Another very important thing for us is the interdisciplinary approach. As I said before, we try to cover as many disciplines as possible, from the natural sciences to arts and culture. And we always try to combine these things. And I'm going to show you an example in a few minutes on how we combine or try to combine these things, because it's really very interesting. And we don't always teach in this context ourselves. We very often, or for most programs, we invite other people who are experts in other disciplines. We invite scientists, we invite museum people, we invite archaeologists, we invite artists, and they do the programs. Together with us, they develop these programs. So it's always someone there who is really an expert, and we try to make this as easy for the kids to understand as possible. As opposed to most German schools, we have a welcoming atmosphere, so we don't put any pressure on the kids. So they can learn as much as they want. They decide the tempo, so we don't really put any pressure on them. And it usually works. So we had courses on hieroglyphs, for example, a 1 week long course on hieroglyphs. And on the second day, everyone was reading hieroglyphs. It was very interesting to see. And these kids were like, I think, 6 to 9 years old. It was fascinating to see. This I told you before, there's no teacher-centered instruction, so no front teaching. We work together with the kids. It's their tempo. We work accordingly. So if they didn't understand anything, we go back and repeat, or we try different exercises and give them each space for personal development. They can invent things, they can be creative, and they can really, we adapt to them, not the other way around. We have a lot of events taking place, and we also transfer our knowledge to other people. So we have a lot of childcare workers coming to us, teachers, school teachers, and we try to explain them our methods, and they try to take as much as possible back to school or back to kindergarten. It has been very successful. We have evaluations of these events, and it's also very interesting to see, but it's too much actually to tell you all about this. So I'm just going to show you 5 examples. I hope I have time enough. If you had a look at me before I started sharing my screen, I was surrounded by a picture of the walk-in heart. So it's actually a very huge.
We can still see you, by the way.
Oh, you can still see me. Oh, okay, so I think this is a better picture actually than the one I'm showing on the slide. It's a virtual background, but it's it's quite a huge heart. I told you that the founder of Kinderakademie, Mr. Bonsall, Professor Bonsall, he was a cardiologist, and he had this big interest of sharing his knowledge in cardiology to a wider audience, especially to children. You know, the heart as a center of the body, as a center of health care. And we welcome guests, young guests, adult guests, and we offer them guided tours through the heart. And it's very interesting because also here we have these experts, the people who are giving or offering these guided tours. They work in the hospital, in the cardiac catheterization laboratory. So they're real experts. They explain to the children in a very childlike and welcoming atmosphere everything they want to know, or they ever wanted to know, or they never wanted to know about the heart. But for all, it's really interesting because they also can do practical things. They can exercise, as you can see on the right hand side. And just, I mean, for you to get a short oh God, this slideshow, I'm so sorry that this is, I'm trying to start a video clip. It's very short. It was on German television once, that you get an impression on how the heart looks from inside, because you can really walk in, and it's the as far as I know, it's the only heart this size in the whole world, at least I know for Europe. So it's the whole in Europe, the whole the only walk-in heart. So I'm just going to share this clip. So it didn't really work, but I think you get a small impression. It's difficult to take pictures or clips inside because it's dark. There's a special sound system, there's a special light system, but well, at the end of the guided tour, the guests are able to walk through the heart. So this is another example. We are working on an exhibition right now. So we usually have the standard things in the museum, like the heart and all these playful objects, but we usually have 3 to 6 special exhibitions per year. And we are opening an exhibition in about 2 weeks time, on the 10th of June. It's on ants. Very fascinating subject. As Elif mentioned, I have a background in archaeology, so I had really no idea about ants or natural sciences, but it's really fascinating to speak with the experts and try to take out all these information and try to convey them to children and young adults and also grown-ups in a very understandable and easy way. So these are just a few pictures I wanted to show. This is another clip. I mean, this should, let's see, this is a view into our one of our special exhibition rooms. We have a graffiti artist who's painting the walls. So this is not the end result yet. He's still working on this, and he apologizes deeply. He says, well, it's not finished yet, but at least to get an impression on what we do. So we work together with artists in this exhibition. We work together with natural scientists who explain objects. For example, we are going to have models of ants. We are having embers with ants inside. We are having fossils. We have living ants inside the building, so a so-called formicarium. So there's a lot of stuff going on with which you can learn about natural sciences, but you also have this kind of aesthetics and the graffiti work. And this graffiti artist is also going to offer workshops for kids and young adults on how to do graffiti. So it's like this interdisciplinary approach I was talking before, arts combined with natural sciences. So this is one of the examples. This is another example which belongs to the academy. This is actually one of my favorite or most favorite programs. We have done this within a week time, and we are now developing a new program on the same topic, which takes around 2 hours. It's about a so-called scriptorium. Maybe you're not familiar with the word scriptorium itself. It's a place where people came together and were writing books or other documents. And Fulda has a great history. It had a scriptorium in the Carolingian time already, a very famous scriptorium. So we have originals here in town, which we can look at. So on the left-hand side, you see 2 kids looking at a manuscript written on parchment with colors and you see initials there. And so we tried to explain them how, these people were working or writing books in the early days, how they proceeded, how they shaped the book, what kinds of methods they used for creating colors. And this is very interesting. On the right hand side, you can see how we work with the kids. So we explain them, this is the way people were developing colors in the early days, in the Carolingian days. We can still do this today, and it's very eye-opening for the kids. In fact, to see that you can paint, you can start painting with vegetables, you can start painting with lice, you can you can be very creative. You just don't go always to the shop and buy colors. You can use what surrounds you. You can use the earth from the garden. You can use grass, whatever. And this is really very, very fascinating to see. So we combine theory with practice. And this is also another example of this 1 week long course we had on the scriptorium. So you see, they were trying to paint with gold. They were trying to do initials, this big M on the right hand side. And they were also doing their own, or creating their own colors, as you can see here inside these shells. It was great fun. And we have, this is one of the examples which belongs to the cultural and artistic realm. We also have the natural science, as I said before. We have the Inventors Workshop. This is another program. School kids come here for 1 week, spend time at Kinderakademie Fulda, and learn things they don't learn at school yet. So they learn about the electric circuit, about motors. They start building their own cities, with electrical bulbs, cables, and with propellers, with cars. So this is stuff they don't learn in school. But we have the power and we have the possibility to teach this to them in a very familiar surrounding, in a very welcoming surrounding, with no pressure. And it's really it's a really great project. 1 week they stay here. So instead of going to school, they come here for 1 week and learn about these kinds of things. And this is just, short introduction in what we are doing here. We also have an art school, as you can see here. So these are regular courses taking part on every day of the week. There's pottery, there's painting. It's a never-ending story. I could actually talk for 2 weeks about our programs. As I said, there's a great variety, and kids really enjoy being here. This is one of a view into a small exhibition we had directly after the first opening, or after the first shutdown. Kids wanted to paint themselves with their masks on, and it's a very a very popular topic right now. It still is, and I'm sure we are going to talk a lot about children and Corona after my presentation, and there is much more to say about this. But for now, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, I'm open for any question. As you might have been able to see, so it was more like a practical view into my work, and nothing really about theoretical approaches. So yeah, but I'm happy to answer all your questions, all the questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. It's wonderful to hear what you are actually doing there. And it was nice to have a theoretical and a practical presentation. They kind of complete the whole picture for us. So are there any questions? There is a long message to Deniz, I think, in the chat box. I will read that later. Are there any questions to Yvonne? Ayşe has a question, I can see. Please, Ayşe. I need to open. No. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you for this presentation. In terms of methodology, I would like to ask to Dr. Ivana. You mentioned this for the methodology part, stimuli for different senses. Mm-hmm. In terms of methodology, did you apply sensory ethnography, or did I miss?
No, I was only talking about children who visit us, and that we really want to to play with their senses. So let's say, well, I mean, this is also the problem I have with online teaching. So this is another topic, I know, but it just popped up in my mind because we have this art school and we were not able to teach the kids in our building. So we had to start developing online concepts. But it's really difficult, especially for the age from, let's say, 6 to 10 years old. You know, you only see, you only watch. We also had online guided tours live, and it was really difficult to draw their attention to us, because they're just sitting there on the screen. And usually we have them here, we let them touch things, we let them smell things, and it's always different when you can work with your hands and with your eyes, with your nose, everything together. So this is what I meant. So this is, I think, at the end you have better memories, I think, of the things you learned. Yeah, the more stimuli you touch, the better it is, I think. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for it.
Deniz ended her presentation with a kind of question asking, so what will you do now? I mean, okay, we have this situation in hand, and what is next? Am I right in putting it that way? So I was thinking, like, museums or kinder institutions like Kinder Academy are kind of potential for as places to let children to reproduce culture. Because as far as I could tell from your presentation, there is not much room left for childhood to be practiced. So I was wondering if childhood studies are looking at museums, or museums are looking at childhood studies. Are they like supporting each other in that respect? Are you aware of any studies like that?
We should start a cooperation. Well, I mean, of course, we always look at the surroundings. So as I said before, it's difficult to get certain people into the museum, because maybe they sit at home, they watch the telly, they're too lazy to come here, they don't even know that we exist or offer programs. So It's actually very easy to come here. The prices are very, very small. Some programs are offered for free, but it's still difficult to reach out. So, and this is one of our big problems. And I don't know if Dennis maybe can offer a solution for this. So we go out into the streets, we try to present ourselves, but it's very difficult because usually it's the people who already have an interest or a background in culture who come here. Huh? And so these are, let's say, middle-class families very often. And that's a problem. It doesn't answer your question, Elif, but...
no, I mean, I think there is no answer to this question. Yeah. Deniz, would you like to say something, please? You can you open your microphone because
but Deniz said some I think I opened your microphone.
Okay,
some internet problems, I think, still.
No, I hope that this will work.
Yes.
I just wanted to say I don't have a question about this, but I have an example. In London, there's this lovely Museum of Childhood, Victoria and Albert Museum of Childhood. And it used to be a childhood, a museum of childhoods long gone. So it was devoted to displaying very old traditional toys and stuff like that. But then children reclaimed it. So the children who visited the museum said that they wanted more participation and they wanted to be more involved in the museum. So in the end, they decided to keep one part of the museum as a museum for childhood, and then one part of the museum as a museum of children. So they're now developing a new kind of museum. And I really hope that they have taken a look at your perfect example of having children involved in this. And there are some really exciting studies about crosses between museums and childhood. And one of those I know is, I'm trying to remember her surname. Anna from Linköping University is working on a similar project on this, but I will DM you later on to send you her name, and maybe you will be interested.
Yes, I will be, definitely. Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Or any contribution, if anyone feels like?
It's also interesting that museums, sorry. Yes, please go.
Raising hand again.
Ayşe.
Thank you, Ayşe, for your all for the questions and contribution. You are the best.
It's not a question, it's just a contribution and statement. Dr. Arzuk's contribution on children museums reminds me the agency of childhood in contributing to culture. As I remember from William Corsara's work in the sociology of childhood, he insisted that children are play active role in society while they are creating their own culture. They also contributing to adult culture. It's just a contribution to that. It reminds me the participation of museum and the contributing the culture in general.
Deniz, do you want to say something, or shall I continue with the next question? No.
There was a question in the chat. I don't know if I could maybe quickly reply to this one. Thank you very much for the question. It's about virtual reality in our museum. So we usually have hands-on objects, which means it's very important to touch, touch and feel and so on. And we decided for quite a long while against using screens, televisions and PCs, because it's always, whenever I go to a museum and see such a thing, a screen or whatever pops up, it very often doesn't work. So it's not, you cannot really use it, or it's outdated. And whenever you see kids working with this stuff, they're just pressing buttons randomly, and they don't really care what kind of information is giving. But we are doing, we are trying something now. For the ant exhibition, we bought a beamer, a touch screen projector, it's called. Beamer is the German word. I'm sorry for this. I know we use this English word, which doesn't really exist in English, a touch screen projector. So it shows, one of these ant, earth, whatever, how is this called in English? I'm sorry. These big heaps of earth, they're living inside these ants, and you can press single objects. Goodbye. You can press single objects, and these ants start walking. They start walking to the queen, let's say, and the queen says this, and the ant is going to walk somewhere else. So we try to use this projector now, but I don't have any experience yet. So will probably be the same as with any other screen you use, that you touch and touch and touch. I don't know how they will deal with this projector. So we will see. I can report in, let's say, 2 months, then I can tell you the results of how people or how the guests accepted this. So.
I would like to say something about children's culture and how that's reproduced and how children reshape adult culture. David Buckingham has done some really interesting work on children and television. I guess you know about him. And some of his findings of children reworking adult culture addressed to them or targeted to them, and making something new out of it was really interesting. So I think participatory research will tell us a lot about how children take culture produced by adults and how they themselves produce culture. And that was one thing. And there was one question in the chat box. Shall I say something about that?
Yeah, sure. Please.
Okay.
Which one? The Ömer Külhancis or?
I think so.
Yes.
My connection broke, so I don't see the question now, but from what I remember, it's about social capital.
You are talking about Ömer Külhancis' comment and question. The childhood experience looks similar to adulthood, that one. Looks similar to adulthood. Thus, I found it unlived part of life chapter. Even before Industrial Revolution, the children cannot experience being childish-like experiences, though it had have been better before revolution. Such experiences could be children's free time. Many of them have to be in labor and cannot reach education. Thanks for the answer. I try to understand it in regards to what categories children perceive about the childhood features, what concepts would be beneficial to understand children's understanding of social world in terms of social capital they accumulate and inherited. That was the question. My point of view depends on psychology, and I try to assimilate social capital concept to understand children's categories. I guess my understanding of childhood does not grasp the literature. My point is that maybe children are rarely to be explorative and free. The identity of childhood is hooked. They have to prepare for exams or well adjusted to their parents' subjects. It was a real beneficial presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. I wanted to say that perhaps it might be good to adopt a historicized perspective on what childhood used to be like and what how childhood changes. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it would be better before, it would have been better before the Industrial Revolution. And from the perspective of children, I think that's not a very relevant question too, because they spend their lives living with children who are occupying the world today. So they don't really compare their lives with how childhood was before the Industrial Revolution. So maybe it might be more beneficial to consider how children are positioned in relation to each other. So today's children, today's working class children are positioned in terms of today's middle class childhoods and so on. And I think Annette Laurent's work might be good to turn to in terms of looking at childhood from the perspective of Bourdieu. I will put it in the chat box now so that, and also quite recently, Berry Mayal also worked on Bourdieu and how his theories relate to childhood. So that might be an interesting theoretical perspective to look at. And thank you for the question.
And may I contribute or ask a little bit connected question? Can we also question being childlike and childish? Isn't it also socially constructed? Since how can we describe it? Since it is changing contextually, relationally, and during time. So how can we easily define it? Maybe you can also comment on it a little bit more, if you feel like.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That really is important to consider. I think we should refrain from categorizing childhoods or perhaps creating a hierarchy of good childhoods, acceptable childhoods, better childhoods, worse childhoods. And because in the end, I think that results in discriminating against children in many ways. We start to normalize the presence of different standards for different childhoods, and childhood is a stage of life, and that is something that everyone has. And it might be different in different parts of the world, but in different families, in different classes. But I think the important point is to perhaps try and see how those kinds of reflections build on our own understandings of childhood and what it should be like and how it should be categorized. So I agree with you in the importance of recognizing the social constructedness of it all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yvonne, I want to ask a personal question, actually, not a personal question, but a personal experience, let's say. Did you come across with any situations where you thought, oh, children taught that way, it's not the way that we are accustomed to teach or to see, let's say, for example, I'm actually repeating my question maybe, but have you seen them reproducing cultures? Really?
Now you hear me. Every other day we experience this because, it's not always the same children we have in the museum, it's always others, and you always have to adapt to them. And they come with so many interesting things. And it's always a surprise. So you don't really, you don't always know where the whole program is going at the very end. So there's no aim actually, yeah? So, okay, the aim is there, the purpose is there. You want to teach the kids, let's say, something about Van Gogh or Da Vinci or whatever, but you don't want to teach them certain facts. And sometimes they come up with really interesting ideas. And that's why we always, also in the development of new programs, we always consult children. So that's, I think, very interesting. But these programs are also subject of development. So it's always work in progress, actually, always. So it's no fixed lecture.
Full of surprises.
Well, every other day we have surprises, and that's very funny to see.
Excellent.
We learn from the kids actually. It's really amazing, you know. Also the kind of knowledge they convey, and sometimes, you know, we have school classes from let's say lower class areas in town, yeah, and they are very happy when they come here, and they bring so much knowledge, and sometimes you're really surprised. And the funny thing is also that teachers say, oh, this guy, he's speaking so much today in your program, he never talks at all at school. Yeah, so this is maybe also the different environment, and I don't know, it's full of
or the opportunity. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Every day is full of surprises.
Okay, thanks. Are there any other questions to our speakers? Demis, please.
I just wanted to add that when Yvonne said we learn from children a lot, and we do, this is usually something of a surprise from people outside child studies or people who work with children. It comes as a surprise that we do learn from children. And maybe this will tie this with childhood during lockdown and during Corona. Mm-hmm. One thing that is ignored most of the time is that children do have a lot of valuable contributions to make, especially in terms of creating responses to a crisis such as this one. So we have to listen to what children have to say about this, not only to help children themselves, but also because children can really help us. For example, some studies have shown that when children are actively involved in crisis responses, the outcomes are usually much better than when everything is done by adults. So I think that is one of the important inputs of childhood studies, that we should really listen to children, not only for children themselves, but also for the society as a whole.
Yes, thanks. This was a perfect kind of message to end.
And to our,
but I just want to ask for the last.
By the way, if there is not any other question or contribution, I will take the opportunity to announce our next seminar. Demet Lüküsü is with us. She will be our one of the speakers in our next seminar next month, 24th of June. In pandemic, time issue is very complicated. I can't even confuse the months. Demet will be talking, we will grow up next month. We will start talking about youth issues. Youth studies will be our subject area, and Demet will contribute us. Thank you now, even contributing to this one. And thank you all for all your contributions, presentations, and questions, your presence, feeling your existence, even just being here all together, it's very valuable for us. Thank you all. Is there any?
Yes, I also want to thank you all, especially to our speakers. That has been a wonderful event.
It was a great pleasure. It was a great time out from their daily routine. So I'm really happy.
Likewise.
Good to hear that. Okay.
Yes, thanks. Hope to see you in our other seminars, and hopefully in person here in Izmir or somewhere else again.
Yes, hopefully.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
So,
bye.
Bye. So we're just leaving, I guess. I don't know.